Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I have with me today Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri. He was India's ambassador to Nepal from 2017 till 2019. He's also been India's ambassador to the European Union and other destinations. Welcome to ThePrint, sir.
Thank you very much, Nayanima. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So if I can start with what has happened in Nepal in the past many months that we've been watching, the internal political turmoil that was going on. And then we saw Prime Minister Sher Bahadur Deuba coming in while Prime Minister Oli was sort of shown the door by the Supreme Court. How do you analyze this? And do you think that this end of the day strengthens their constitution more, which was the center of all these tensions that we were seeing?
Nayanima, thank you very much. I think that's a great question. So let me say something to you. One of the things that comes out, and this is in a light-hearted manner, even COVID couldn't keep Nepalese politicians under lockdown. Nepal is a country which never ceases to amaze in terms of politics. Everyone is kosher. All kinds of friends can be made and all kinds of friends can be ditched, given the right kinds of putting things together. That's the nature of Nepalese politics in general. But now we come to the specific aspect. Look, you asked me the question about the constitution. The Nepalese constitution, I think, tried to do several things, but some of the things in terms of politics was to try and ensure that it had instruments within it which would ensure that you won't have frequent dissolutions of parliament as was happening prior to 2015. And somehow it would appear to me that the Supreme Court's judgment, the two judgments, the one in February and the one now, have underlined this fact that Nepalese MPs need to make every effort to see that there is a government and take things forward. That has been very strongly underlined out here. The second thing that I would like to make, which is perhaps different from a point that ThePrint has been making in terms of its program, is that the Nepalese constitution, in fact, has ensured that in Nepal, in the parliament, there is always scope and room for the opposition. Let me illustrate this point. Very often in India, we tend to think that proportional representation is the buzzword for everything being topsy-turvy. But on the other hand, if there had been no proportional representation in Nepalese situation today, after the 2017 election, Mr. Oli and his party would have had 90% of the seats in parliament. And where was the issue of opposition, which in my opinion is absolutely germane to what is democracy. And therefore, I think this is good. And I am glad that the Supreme Court has gone about it and has reinforced these particular points. Of course, many people can turn around and say that the floor test is really the way in which you appoint a prime minister in a parliamentary democracy. The Supreme Court in Nepal said that the caretaker appointed by the president stands annulled, and instead Mr. Deuba will become the caretaker and then he takes the floor test. Perhaps they've gone a little too far, but perhaps that is the nature of the case that was brought in front of them. So they took a certain position in terms of adjudicating that case.
What I'm more interested in right now is to understand whether Prime Minister Deuba, who got appointed as the Prime Minister of Nepal for the 5th time, India is well aware about his style of governance and his probably thinking process. Do you think this sort of augurs well as far as bilateral ties between New Delhi and Kathmandu is concerned? Because under the second tenure of Oli, we've seen what had happened in terms of the map disaster, which I'll come a little later. But how friendly do you think Prime Minister Deuba is going to be, considering the fact that in Nepal, somehow this is now a fashion to say that, okay, if you're supporting India, you're becoming their slave. This is so much of anti-India sentiment, which is why I'm asking you this question, sir.
So let me start by the end of your question. You know, anti-Indianism is almost the credo for nationalism in Nepal. So this is not a new thing. This has always happened. Even during the monarchy, the king used to play this game. So we are all accustomed to this, and we know that this is the nature in the way the Pahari society is molded and played by their own politicians. Mr. Deuba is no different. Mr. Oli is no different. Remember, when the map thing happened and there had to be a constitutional amendment, every single MP in the Nepali House of Representatives voted for it, barring 3 or 4 people and a few others who were not well, etc. And this also included the Madhesis. So that's the nature of the game. That's something we must understand and accept as a sort of a DNA issue as far as Nepal and Nepalese politics are concerned. You're talking about Mr. Deuba. This is the 5th time that he's become Prime Minister. The first time that he became Prime Minister was in the mid-1990s. I was at that time Deputy Chief of Protocol in Delhi and accompanied him during the state visit when the Mahakali Treaty was signed. And when I went as ambassador to Nepal just a few years back, I used to laughingly tell him, Mr. Deuba, you became Prime Minister for the first time when I joined the Foreign Service. I'm about to retire, you are still the Prime Minister. You know, that's his longevity. He tells everyone that the Joshi has told him that he will serve 7 times. No one thought that would be possible when Mr. Oli won 2/3 of the seats. But obviously the Joshi seems to know something more. You are asking about India. Look, India has good relations and old relations with the Nepali Congress, and that includes Mr. Deuba. But I think one thing we need to understand is that the general perception had been that somehow we were we did give a sense of a prop for Mr. Oli, especially in the last 6 odd months, both in December as well as now, because, and this is best evidenced by the fact that one faction of the Janata Samaj Party, the party which really represents the Madhes, half of it, and these are people who are well known to be friendly towards India, they joined Mr. Oli. In fact, he had one of them sworn in as Deputy Prime Minister, something that the court then later on annulled. So there will be a certain amount of issue in which a little bit of work would have to be done, but we have old relationships, and I don't think pivoting is such a difficult task. Remember, for any Nepalese politician, there is also a certain amount of self-interest and more than anything else, a opportunity for reaching out to his own people if relations with India are good and they are building and going forward. It gives him an opportunity to do things, and Mr. Deuba has, of course, a lot of experience. So I do think that even if there's a pivot required, it will be there and things will go forward.
So now coming to the issue which, a lot of time in last year was spent on the fact that whether bilateral ties between India and Nepal are headed for a complete, it was plummeting. But then we saw several high-level visits also taking place. Their previous foreign minister, Mr. Gewali, was here. But then the thing that remains is that the boundary issue never got discussed formally at the level of the foreign secretaries. Something that was promised by India in 2014 when Prime Minister went there. It was a hugely successful visit. So the fact remains, and what the Nepali government and the common Nepali citizens also talk about, the fact that why did you not resolve the issue when the time was right? We saw that, they've been talking about it when India-China also talked about opening up the Lipu Lake border. Then eventually whatever had happened in 2020, everyone is aware about that. So how do you think that issue will be resolved in the coming future?
Look, let me make one little point to you on so-called border issues. For many years, there have been discussions between India and Nepal on 2 points regarding the border between the 2 countries. One is an area called Susta, which is in the southern part of Nepal. And the other is this area called Kalapani. That's the area. Now, that is not the area that you are referring to. What Mr. Oli has done is to have come across a huge new area of about 300 or 400 square kilometers and laid claim to it. This is not what has been under discussion for years and which are really small sticking points that need to be resolved in terms of where the border actually is, etc. He has now laid claim and put it down in a sense in the Nepalese constitution in terms of the map of Nepal by laying claim to a completely new set of areas which is very close to areas from where the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, etc. takes place. This is a very difficult subject matter to address and a very difficult subject matter to even resolve, I must tell you that. make note of this point, that when this constitutional amendment was brought in the Nepalese parliament, almost all MPs voted for it. Hardly anybody said, no, you shouldn't do it, because you are now stirring up elements of nationalism which are of an extreme nature. It will take a great deal of sagacity on both sides, and in particular on the Nepalese side, because the reality is this area was never theirs. It has never been there, but you've laid claim to it and you've also put it in your constitution. How do you resolve it? Difficult, extremely difficult task, and I'm not sure that in some senses an immediate resolution is the way forward. In various senses, people would say, let's look at other ways of doing things, because an unnecessary chapter has got opened, which was not existing and did not exist. But do look at it, that from 15th of August last, Oli called up our Prime Minister and congratulated him on our Independence Day. Many things have happened which have tended to cement India-Nepal relations. And let me make one point to your viewers, very interesting one. Only the other day, we signed another agreement for building another huge hydroelectric project, which is in the lower Arun. This is a seminal forward movement in terms of India-Nepal relations. And these are the kind of things that we need to do, and we need to work to take them forward, because they build links between the countries, between the people, and stick no matter who is in power.
Mm-hmm. So now, if I come to the factor that also worries India a lot, and rightly so, is the role that is being played by China in Nepal, and the growing ties between Nepal and China, which is obvious because these are the two big neighbors that Nepal anyway has. But Nepal is also part of BRI, and we've seen that how an effort was made by Beijing to sort of keep these two, quarreling the factions of the Communist Party together.
So let me draw your attention to something which is factual. Last time Mr. Deuba was Prime Minister, he was Prime Minister from June of 2017 to, I think, end of January or February of 2018. During the time, he paid a state visit to India, and of course, lots of politics happened, but he didn't go to China. Now, it doesn't mean that he doesn't have relations there or they don't have reach to him. The Chinese are now serious players in Nepal, and this is a result of the fact that they have lots of economics available to them. They now have technologies available to them. And remember, they also share a huge, long border with China, with Nepal. So, this is something that we in India tend to forget. But technology has made them be able to come right into Tibet. They are there. And so the Nepalese also have a vested interest in keeping them, let me say, on their right side. That's important. And they play the game, which they play because they have the kind of money, power, etc. Our interest, I think we need to note this. If in the first half of 2020, the general feeling among Indian media was that the Chinese were calling all the shots in Nepal, I would like to draw the attention of all your colleagues that what happened in the second half of 2020, were they not kind of missing in action? Of course, 3 or 4 days back, just before the Supreme Court judgment, perhaps totally unrelated to this, they did announce the creation of a China South Asia Poverty Alleviation Center, which they said the Nepalese, the Bangladeshis, the Sri Lankans, the Afghans and the Pakistanis had said yes to. I'm not very familiar with all of these things. So look, China is a fact. It is a fact that has to be there. But remember the state of play of India and our equities there. A simple factor. Trade of Nepal's international trade, more than 2/3 is with India. And this has not diminished even in the last few years, despite all this talk about Chinese border, this, that, and the other. Nothing like that happened. The Nepalese remain intertwined with India societally, economically, etc. But we need to play this also. We need to work hard. And I like this idea of Lower Arun project coming our way. We need to build these linkages. We need to work on them. The Chinese will remain players. I don't think we should underestimate that. But Nayanima, let me make one point to you, which is not often made in the Indian media and to the Indian public. We must understand that in the last 20 odd years, Nepal has had an increased exposure to globalization, and by this I mean the West. And today we must be cognizant of the fact that Western countries have direct and perhaps slightly divergent interests from India in Nepal, and there is a degree of activity which takes place and a certain degree of influencing thinking in Nepal. This is something that we in India must understand, that there is a changing Nepal, which we need to understand. It's not just the old civilizational links, etc.
Mm-hmm. Sir, and also the dynamics, and since you brought this topic up, that the Western countries are now directly having links with Nepal. We've seen how the US is now pushing for the MCC and other things. How do you see that dynamics playing out there now, sir?
Look, people used to say that Mr. Oli was playing a brilliant job with all three of the important players, India, China, as well as the United States. Now, MCC can bring some economic dividends to Nepal. Whether Mr. Deuba will be able to manage the contradictions, because, opposition to even good things in Nepal does not take place because the thing is not good or it's good. It takes place because there is a need for doing an opposition. Look at the Mahakali Treaty, signed in 1995. It was opposed from Mr. Oli's party, not by him. He stood for it. It was opposed because it made sense for them to make political opposition. And that has been the crux of the issue regarding the Millennium Challenge Corporation and its ideas to fund the kind of electrification and the grid situations in Nepal. But in my personal understanding, it is India which has a vested interest in Nepal, and I think Nepal has a vested interest in what is happening in India. And I am a bit old-fashioned, but my continued feeling remains that as far as Nepal, forget other countries in South Asia, as far as Nepal is concerned, our policies must be ekla chalo re. It doesn't mean that you don't cooperate and do things with others. The Western countries, they bring technology, they may bring some monies, etc. But we have our reasons, and for all the rest, it's peripheral in various ways, no matter the fact that China is close to them. After all, we've seen what happened in the 1950s and elsewhere.
Right. So now what I wanted to also understand, and what intrigues when we just Nepal, is the fact that, and you were there at that point of time when both these factions of the Communist Party came together, which sort of looked impossible, but then that did happen. And there was a power sharing deal in 2018 between Oli and Prachand. And you were there in the thick of things at that point of time. How did it look at that point of time, and why do you think things got unraveled so quickly, and now it seems that they never can come together again?
So I'm not sure about never can come together again. In Nepal, there are no such things as permanent friends and permanent enemy. Mr. Oli and Mr. Prachand were partners in a previous government also in 2016. So they have always done this breakup, come together, etc., depending on the numbers game that you have available. My understanding of why Mr. Prachand broke away from Nepali Congress and joined Mr. Oli was that the elections were impending. He had seen the situation that his own popularity and ability to win votes was coming down. So forget the fact that the Chinese were interested in bringing all the left parties together. That may be so. But Mr. Prachand would have found it impossible, either by himself or in partnership with Mr. Deuba, to get the 50 seats that he has currently in parliament. And there was therefore self-interest driven. And no matter what anyone could have done to keep himself alive and to keep himself relevant, at least for one more term, he had to align with those who were going to be on the winning side. Now, Mr. Oli looked at it like a win-win situation, because the gap between a 2/3 majority and let's say 50%, he saw that he could spin this off by including Mr. Prachand, and that I would later on, let me say, deal with him. And that's exactly what happened. While at the time of coming together in 2017, Mr. Oli offered Mr. Prachand extremely generous numbers, like 40% of the candidates, 40% of the seats. Many people asked him, why are you offering so many? And of course, his answer was, we won't win so many, so how does it matter? But actually, they won everything. And so when they came to the parliament, after a little while, Mr. Prachand started demanding his share. And one of the ideas was that after 2 years or so, either you have a switch in the prime ministership, or at least the Communist Party's chairmanship should be given to Prachand, and so on. But Mr. Oli was loath to do any of them. And thereafter, it was not only the fact that within his own party, the UML, there were issues with Mr. Madhav Kumar Nepal, who he had narrowly defeated in an intra-party election to become chairman some years earlier. But now you had this entire issue of Prachand within the government, and yet all the time gnawing and demanding. And hence Mr. Oli kept on playing the game various ways. When finally he said, well, the best way out for me is to dissolve the house. 6 months I shall remain interim prime minister and we shall see what happens after that. It didn't happen because the Supreme Court didn't let it happen.
Sir, so now if I can ask you, it's now clear to me the way you explained it. But what I also wanted to understand, there is this clamor again growing in Nepal, and we keep hearing this time and again from there that, the monarchy should return. And then there are these rumors, you can say, certain kind of reports that India is also supporting bringing back the Hindu Rashtra and other things. What do you have to say to all these voices? Are these true? Is the monarchy gearing up? What is it going on?
I also hear this. And many people say, perhaps these were some of the promises that maybe Mr. Oli did. I don't know the answers. I'm not part of it. I am retired a year and a half back. I really don't know anything of these kinds. But let me point out one or two things to you. That the pro-monarchical parties did not do well in the elections in 2017. I think they got one seat, that too by just some good luck somewhere here or there. There is some kind of a sort of a feeling among some people. But is it really enough to be able to take things forward? I don't know the answers to that. But again, the way I look at it, Nepal, despite all this monarchy, and when we all talk about stability, let's understand that Nepal had some 60 odd years of stability, monarchical rule. And then what happened? Did it have much development? Did many things go forward? The answer is no. For many of us, we tend to think that if you have stability, you can have a great deal of economic growth. Look what the monarchy did for Nepal. Precious little. At a time when the world would have been very generous to a small country. And yet they were unable to harness even the goodwill of India or the goodwill of the rest of the world in terms of development aid, etc. Nepal remains a poor country, remains a country which is just about graduating from LDC status. So, has all this been good? No. I firmly believe that democracy is a good option. But on the other hand, there is a swell of people who do think or who yearn for the facts of, monarchy, should I say, or a non-secular, let me say, a Hindu Rashtra. Incidentally, I must point out, while Nepal is overwhelmingly Hindu, in its last census, which was also conducted 10 years back, 81% of Nepalese population was Hindu. That's, 1 percentage point higher than what was reported in the Indian census. The fact is that it technically became a Hindu kingdom only in 1962. But it's a given fact. And in various senses, they perhaps take this for granted that we are a Hindu country. Everybody is Hindu. And the others are Buddhist, so there's a syncretic link to it. This is something that somehow maybe people in Nepal tend to take much more for granted that we sitting here in India tend to think.
Is this going to be in the larger scheme of things for India when it comes to the neighborhood policy? Will Nepal is something where India needs to put greater focus on, because now we can see that Bangladesh also emerging economically. Sri Lanka is in a different dynamics. Pakistan, let's keep that separate. But when it comes to Nepal, do you think we need to put in more focus there, both in terms of strategy, economic ties, and other things?
I can't agree with you more. I think we tend to somehow or the other think that Nepal is ours. We need to move out a little bit from this. Let me make 2 or 3 points to you. When we look at India's export statistics, while we export about $30+ billion worth of goods to the United States and the United Arab Emirates and about 15-20 billion to Hong Kong, China put together, the next 8 or 10 set of countries are in the region of about 7-8 billion to about 5 billion. Nepal sometimes ranks 10, sometimes ranks 9. But given the fact that we have an open border and a lot of personal individual trade takes place easily, I won't even call it, taking place surreptitiously. It just takes place in a normal course. It is my considered belief that if you look at India's exports, Nepal invariably is among the top 5 export destinations. So I think it is a very important country for us economically. It is very important for our investments. It's very important for our people. Just as there are Nepalese working in India, Indians are also working in Nepal. This is the beauty of the 1950 treaty, which allows this kind of national treatment with all its limitations. For me, and I like the point that you made, we must understand that Nepal in today's modern world is a foreign country, but a foreign country with which we have civilizational ties, we have geographical ties, we have historical ties, we have economic ties. And we must be very cognizant of this fact that these are ties that need to be nurtured, they need to be taken forward, and we need to put our best foot forward. I'll make one simple point to you. When we do development projects in Nepal, I think it is extremely important to remember that it is a foreign country. Your best foot forward should be put there. And we should not think that yet it is some other, something like a state in India. Nepal is a foreign country. Its president comparatives should be with our president and others, even though it's a smaller country. And when we do this and realize that this is the changing world and that the Nepalese today have been exposed to globalization, then I think the advantage of civilizational links and more than anything else, the geographical advantages will always mean that India's equities are heavy.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much. So that was Ambassador Puri, making it easy for us to understand what is going on in our neighborhood in Nepal. Thank you for watching this interview. You can now take subscription if you've liked this interview on our YouTube channel, and you'll get exclusive benefits for just rupees 159 per month. Ambassador Puri, thank you so much for your time. Please take care.
Thank you so much.